Hello, everyone. Good to have people joining on the webinar right now. I understand we have well over 2,000 people registered, and we've got a really good lineup of speakers for you. And it's on a very, very important topic, which is the deadly H5N1 bird flu that we know is around the world, has been spreading to every continent except for Australia, and has a very good chance of turning up in Australia and will be very devastating to our wildlife when it gets here. Firstly, just introduce myself. I'm Jack Gough. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Invasive Species Council, and I'm hosting this webinar on behalf of a number of environment groups who have been working together on this issue of bird flu and the threats to wildlife. So that's the Biodiversity Council, who have been doing a lot of the work for this webinar, and a shout out to Jana Dielenberg and Candice Bartlett, who have done a lot of the preparation here, as well as the Australian Marine Conservation Society, BirdLife Australia, the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, WIRES, as well as the Invasive Species Council. So I'd firstly like to acknowledge the Dharawal people on the land that I'm coming to you from in Wollongong in New South Wales, and pay my respects to them as traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders of this land that are past, present, and emerging. Our panelists are coming from a range of country around Australia, and we acknowledge that sovereignty has not been ceded in Australia. So this is going to be a pretty short, sharp webinar. It's going to be actually going for the full hour because we've had such a large amount of interest, and the panelists have agreed to stay on. We've got three panelists that will be presenting on topics from the impact that we can expect from bird flu on our wildlife, the preparation that the government has been doing, and also what land managers and others can actually do to prepare in your patch. Just to sort of give some context, I'll say that this is one of the biggest looming threats we have to wildlife in Australia, and it could turn up in spring this year. It has spread to every continent except Australia, and we are really pleased that in recent months we've seen a real shift in departments and in governments, particularly the Federal Department of Agriculture and Environment, in preparing for this. And that's putting Australia in a good position. We know what it's happened overseas. Australia can prepare, and we're starting to see some of that preparation. So this is part of assisting in that preparation. So I'll go now to the first speaker that we have, and the first speaker for us is Dr. Michelle Wille. So she comes from the University of Melbourne. Michelle is a virus ecologist based at the Centre for Pathogenomics, and she's got an honorary position at the WHO Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza. Michelle's research has focused on the ecology and evolution of viruses in wild birds, and she has worked on avian influenza viruses over the past 15 years in Canada, in Sweden, and Australia. So she is an expert and someone who is going to take us through what has happened to wildlife globally and the potential major impacts on Australian wildlife. So I'll hand over to you, Dr. Michelle Wille.
Thank you very much. This talk is fairly high level. It's just really an introduction about the virus that we're talking about compared to sort of some of the other virus strains that are here, and just quite a high level overview of what is going on overseas. If you'd like more details, please feel free to contact me. So we're just going to kind of start just talking about what is avian influenza and the way that we name these viruses. So the first part of the naming scheme is something called subtyping. So we've learned a lot about COVID the last few years, and you may have heard about this thing called the spike protein that's on COVID. That's really pretty important for the virus. In influenza, that spike has essentially been broken into two things called the HA and the NA. Now, influenza viruses have been around for a long time. They've probably been in birds since birds have been birds. And so as a result, there's a lot of diversity in these HAs and NAs. And so we divide them into a numbering scheme. So in birds, we've got 16 different HAs and 9 different NAs, and we report these in combination. So the name of the game today is H5N1, but if you've been reading the papers, you may have learned that in Victoria, we've had outbreaks of H7N9 and H7N3 and things like that. That's what those numbers mean. So within some of these HA subtypes, there is a further subdivision by genetic clades. And so this is sort of similar to COVID variants in terms of diversity, but unlike COVID, we have not used these nice names like Alpha, Beta, and Omicron. Rather, we use this horrific numbering scheme. And so the virus that we're talking about today is not only H5N1, but it is a very specific genetic clade within H5, and it's called 2.3.4.4b. And that's important because we sometimes read about H5N1 in places like Cambodia. That's caused by a different virus, or the return traveler case that we had here in Australia. Again, that's caused by a different genetic clade, and these different genetic clades and subtypes carry with them different risks. You can go to the next slide, please. The other way in which we subdivide these viruses is pathogenicity or pathotypes. So if we go out and catch wild birds in Australia at present, we certainly will find avian influenza viruses. But the viruses we're going to find are called low pathogenic or low pathogenicity. These viruses don't cause any disease in birds. They comprise all the HA and NA subtypes. They're pretty common in birds and they're meant to be there. They have been in birds since birds have been birds. But this is in contrast to the high pathogenic or highly pathogenic viruses. So what happens is that subtype H5 or H7 only go from wild birds into poultry. And in poultry, they evolve and they become very deadly viruses. And these are called high pathogenicity viruses. So this H5N1 virus we're dealing with now, that's a high path virus. And the viruses that were reported here in poultry in Victoria and New South Wales, those were also high pathogenicity viruses. These are viruses that are essentially killing birds. Now, when I made this slide a few years ago, there used to be an extra bullet point there that said uncommon in wild birds. But of course, the situation has changed dramatically in the last few years. So the name of the game here and with the virus we're very concerned about is called high pathogenicity avian influenza H5N1 clade 2344b, which is a mouthful, but I think names are important, and so I just wanted to press that. What you're looking at here is a map of notifications. So whenever these viruses are reported, they are notified to the World Organization for Animal Health, and this is data from 2021 to about March 2024. The different dots there depend whether the notification is in wild birds or poultry. And this could just be one dead wild bird. It could be a poultry house of millions and millions of chickens. Overlaid on top of that, I've added a number of arrows here to show you how this virus has spread dramatically in the last few years. So really with Europe as an epicenter in mid-2021, this virus jumped over the North Atlantic and into North America, arriving for the first time in October 2021. Since then, the virus has jumped into North America on two additional occasions, once over the Pacific and 1 year later again over the Atlantic. But since arriving in North America, it has spread right across the continent, and not only in places where we expect chickens to be, which is how it used to be in the past, but you can see all those dots there in the high Arctic as well. This virus is everywhere. About 1 year after arriving in North America, the virus entered South America. We had 3 separate introductions into South America, however, only one of them seemed to stick. The virus then traveled the 6,000-kilometer spine of South America in about 6 months. So this thing is moving fast. Following reaching the southern tip of South America, it kind of did a 180 and went back north here along the Atlantic coast. About 1 year after arriving in South America, this virus arrived in the subantarctic with records on South Georgia, and just a few months later, it was first detected on the Antarctic Peninsula in February 2024. The only place on the planet where this virus is absent at present is Oceania. So we can have a look a little bit about the wildlife and wild birds that this virus is infecting. So the plot on the left there is from a paper we wrote about a year ago. So I would add an asterisk that this is certainly out of date. So we had a look at all the records in the World Organization for Animal Health database, and we found that this virus has affected 356 species across 21 orders of birds. That is a lot of birds, but of course, more than likely to be out of date now. The little plot on the left there is to show you how this virus has changed with time. So while 2344b is really only since 2021, the progenitors or earlier versions of this virus have been around for quite a long time and have jumped into wild birds a few times. But if you look at the plot, you can see the bars on the left are pretty low, and there's quite a lot of bars on the right. They're very, very high. So the different colors are the bird orders, and the higher the bar, the higher the number of species within that bird order. Now, of course, it's not just wild bird diversity that's been affected. What we're seeing are species and population level consequences. So this is an example, not an outlier, it's just an example. In the country of Peru, about 40% of all the Peruvian pelicans died in about 2 months. That's almost 1 in 2 individuals from this species disappeared from the landscape in just 2 months. Now we can look at all the data from all around the world to try to sort of create a list of wild bird groups that we suspect are susceptible here in Australia. So essentially, all birds that are associated with water, shorebirds, seabirds, waterbirds, are highly impacted by this virus. So I've just put a list there, but essentially ducks, geese, swans, gulls, terns, shorebirds, seabirds, pelicans, herons, ibis, gannets, cormorants, penguins, and everything else. Okay, these birds, we're seeing large diversity of species impacted in these orders and these species level consequence events in these birds. So this is really what we should be focusing on here. The outlier to that are raptors. These are predatory or scavenging birds that are essentially eating dead birds on the landscape, and they themselves are being affected in that way. And so we're not seeing massive outbreaks in raptors, but we are often seeing raptors associated with outbreaks in other species. So in addition to wild birds, we're seeing a lot of impact on wild mammals as well. So more than 56 species have been affected. The vast majority of mammals affected are predatory or scavenging mammals. So these are animals that are eating birds on the landscape. And so cases are very sporadic. But the outlier here are pinnipeds, so seals and sea lions, particularly in South America. So in South America, we've seen about 50,000 pinnipeds die, with 18,000 southern elephant seals projected to have died on Peninsula Valdez, most of these being sort of 1 to 2 week old animals. My colleagues in South America are convinced that we are seeing mammal-to-mammal transmission in these animals, but I think there's still a bit of work to do. Just to wrap this up very briefly, we started doing risk assessment work for death a few years ago, actually. So this is not something that is just on the horizon now. We really have been thinking about this for some time. Unfortunately, the full risk assessment is not available, but an abridged version is available. You can link to it, the QR code there. And part of what we did was try to identify how this virus may arrive in Australia by looking at species that have been affected elsewhere, as well as distribution and migration dynamics of these birds, and we really identified the role of shorebirds and seabirds as being the most likely route of virus arrival. And so the figure there just comprises a few examples. The left one there is just where cases are. The one in the middle there is where Australian flagged shorebirds are stopping along the East Asian Australasian flyway. You kind of squint, you can see that a lot of the dots are in the same place. Okay, so these birds are stopping where we know virus activity to be. And the other group are things like mutton birds. Okay, we know that they're spending time in the non-breeding season up in the Bering Sea, the Sea of Japan. The species has been detected positive in Alaska shortly around the time of when it should be leaving to come to Australia. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data from these birds other than that. So in response to this risk assessment work, Marcel Claassen, who's a deacon, and I have essentially developed an early warning surveillance system, which we've been running in 2022 and 2023, which essentially is that Marcel and I go to as many places as we can in the spring and catch as many birds as we can and test these for avian influenza. And so this here is just to show you what we did last year. So we went out to Broome to catch shorebirds. We were catching shearwaters here and locations, in Victoria and Tasmania. We're very much hoping to run another sort of iteration of this year, but it is very much funding dependent. Without a funding commitment, we can't do this work.
Michelle, I'm going to have to wrap you up there, but just so we've got
Perfect.
time for questions, because
This
we're
is
trying
my
to keep
last
this
slide.
short and punchy. But I can see you've got resources there, and we will include in the chat a link directly to Dr. Michelle Wille's website, which has a huge amount of resources available, and I can see there's a QR code there that people can use to go to that as well. So one thing I just missed in my introduction, I can see a lot of people are using it there. On your Zoom, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you've got questions and you want to put them into that Q&A, we will have hopefully about 20 to 25 minutes for questions to the panelists at the end of this. We now have 1.3 thousand people on the webinar, so that's fantastic turn up, and really appreciate that talk, Michelle. Our next speaker is Dr. Fiona Fraser. She's the Australian Government Threatened Species Commissioner. She's going to talk to us about the government preparedness that has been going on for this alarming disease, which could arrive in Australia this spring. As the Threatened Species Commissioner, Dr. Fiona Fraser's role is to lead the implementation of Australia's Threatened Species Action Plan, along with other initiatives to recover our most imperiled plants and animals. Using the principles of science, action and partnership, Fiona works with First Nations people, conservation organisations, governments, communities and the private sector. Dr. Fraser has a PhD in threatened species and fire ecology in Northern Australia. She's worked for the Australian government for over a decade, playing lead roles in Indigenous caring for country and natural resource management, international environment policy, and the bushfire wildlife recovery response. And I will also just mention that we also have Brant Smith here from the Department of Agriculture, and who will also be participating in that Q&A at the end. So I'll hand over to you, Fiona. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jack, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm joining you from beautiful Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. And Michelle, thanks heaps for that presentation. And really, I just wanted to also say thank you for the enormous contribution you've made over many years to researching and raising awareness of avian influenza. I guess at the outset, I'd also like to acknowledge how confronting the impact of H5 bird flu is, particularly for Indigenous custodians and lovers of Australia's unique biodiversity, which I expect all of us online today are. The potential for an outbreak of bird flu in Australia is really an overwhelming prospect, but one which the Australian government and our state and territory counterparts are taking seriously and are collaborating to prepare for. As H5, and Michelle described it as a horrific numbering scheme, but I'll call it H5 going forward for this presentation, as it hasn't been detected in Australia to date, we're in the fortunate position of being able to learn from those recent experiences of the rest of the world. And core to this is recognising that the impacts of an H5 incursion will be felt across sectors, across agriculture, health and the environment. And to be effective, planning and communications really needs to be coordinated across these sectors. Within this array, my focus as the Australian Government's Threatened Species Commissioner is working with government counterparts and key biodiversity stakeholders to help make sure we've got a clear and shared understanding of and adequate plans for Australia's already threatened species, as well as other species that could be heavily impacted by an H5 outbreak. So I've been invited by Biodiversity Council and partners today. Thank you very much, all of you. This is a great initiative to share and discuss with you national preparedness and response planning with a focus on particularly vulnerable species and places. It's obviously a massive topic and a really quickly evolving space. And so I propose to tackle it by touching on just quickly our established national biosecurity arrangements, further actions which are underway nationally, some of them at the early stages for wildlife response, and then to jump into some specific examples of planning for threatened species and vulnerable places. So our standing national approaches for wildlife emergencies include, and just you can look at the 4 boxes at the top here, taking a One Health approach, essentially a unified approach to animal disease incursions across human health, animal health, and the environment more broadly. And this is going to be more important than ever when it comes to an H5 event. Mature and indeed recently boosted for H5 disease surveillance systems, which are so important for timely detections and early action. And you heard a little bit about that from Michelle. Building the capacity of partners. So a key example of this is government support for Wildlife Health Australia, who you're going to hear from next, to deliver awareness materials and management guidance. And these are critical and available resources for H5 planning. I guess I'd also like to emphasise the importance of other species recovery measures in response to H5, because the reality of this disease is that we will not be able to prevent an incursion, And in many cases, we will not be able to prevent mass mortality events. But by tackling other threats to wildlife, such as invasive predators and other threats, we can increase their resilience and their recovery prospects. And these activities will be more important than ever once H5 reaches Australia. So finally, I've listed here elements of our formal national biosecurity response strategies and arrangements, which of course encompass environmental biosecurity. They are, on the one hand, world-class, but on the other, they will be challenged in an H5 outbreak, given, as we've heard from Michelle, this disease in many ways presents unique challenges in terms of impacts to wildlife. So the collaboration currently afoot for H5 is actually providing an opportunity to further enhance the wildlife aspect of our national biosecurity arrangements. So they're the established arrangements I've just chatted about. Pictured here are the streams of work the government has underway focused on H5 and wildlife. And I don't have time to dive into each of them. I expect there'll be some questions on some of them I don't talk about. But I wanted to give you a sense of what's happening. So we've established a national cross-agency HPAI H5 task force. Among other things, the task force is currently running a series of national simulation exercises that are testing our response capability for an outbreak in wildlife. We're working with experts to better understand the susceptibility of Australian species and compiling information to be able to map and model risks to species and places. And this work is going to be key to guiding prioritisation and decision-making when it comes to effective preparedness and response actions. There's a bunch of other streams of work for wildlife listed here and underway, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to jump to the next slide for a couple of specific examples. So the examples I wanted to run through involve joined up efforts with contributions at different tiers of government, and almost all of them are in partnership with experts, with NGOs and with species recovery teams. So the Victorian government has established a dedicated cross-agency governance structures to coordinate planning for H5. Work includes analysis to identify threatened species most at risk and to identify high-risk locations for potential outbreaks. So this will help with prioritisation of preparedness actions like bolstering the management of other threats that I raised earlier, or species-specific measures such as additional biosecurity infrastructure to protect insurance populations from contracting the virus. And I'll step through an example of that in a moment. The South Australian government has identified 8 sites for risk assessment and preparedness planning. And this is based on their attractiveness to migratory birds or marine mammals or both. And in some cases, also close interaction between people and wildlife. So one example is Seal Bay on Kangaroo Island, where an important breeding colony of endangered sea lions, which are an at-risk species, interacts with water birds. And Seal Bay is also, as many of you will know, a really popular tourist destination. So there are detailed risk assessments and preparedness planning guided by Wildlife Health Australia's HPI toolkits, and which are being prepared for these sites. And I'm actually going to get an opportunity this week to meet with some of the sea lion recovery team members on site at Seal Bay to discuss some of this work, which should be really interesting. Further afield is planning for the Indian Ocean Territory, so Christmas and Cocos Keeling Islands. These are Commonwealth protected areas managed by my colleagues in Parks Australia. They're extraordinarily remote and support really important populations of threatened seabirds and other threatened species. There's quite a bit of preparedness work underway, which includes working with the Northern Australian Quarantine Strategy team to collect and export monthly seabird fecal samples for testing, regional awareness raising, including with island communities, and developing target action response plans. We're also working with the Australian Registry of Wildlife Health to develop a standard operating procedure for H5 sample collection and submission from all of the Commonwealth protected areas across the country, which sort of sounds straightforward, but it's actually a huge body of work, and the legislative requirements for moving biological samples from external territories like Christmas Island are really complex. So, species-specific example. The orange-bellied parrot, critically endangered species, probably only a couple of hundred in the wild, and its persistence is highly dependent on supplementation with birds bred in captivity. So the governments and many non-government partners which make up the recovery team for this species are undertaking species-specific planning. As they are migratory between Tasmania and mostly Victoria, They can associate with shorebirds in coastal areas, and so hence there's a pretty high risk of H5 transmission. The species' reliance on captive breeding puts it at additional risk, as if there is an H5 outbreak, as well as potential direct mortality events, the control or quarantine measures may restrict transfer and release of captive bred individuals, which are needed to sustain wild populations. So captive breeding facilities for these parrots are being encouraged to undertake the necessary biosecurity reviews and preparedness activities using, again, Wildlife Health Australia and Zoo and Aquarium Association resources. On captive populations of threatened species at a national level, we're working closely with the Zoo and Aquarium Association. Many of their facilities are actively engaged in preparing response plans using the Wildlife Health Australia toolboxes. Many play an important role, of course, in threatened species conservation. So the orange-bellied parrot is just one high-profile example, but there are many more critical insurance populations in captivity that will need to be protected from H5. Data on which species are housed where, their importance to national threatened species recovery programs will be an important input to our national threatened species mapping and modelling exercise. So I'll wrap up, and in doing so, I would like to emphasise that this is hard and it will get harder. All countries have or are struggling with H5, and in many cases, we will not be able to prevent impacts to wildlife. But we do have solid biosecurity arrangements, and we are pursuing with vigour our preparedness efforts for vulnerable species and places. Finally, humans are going to need to take care in terms of your physical health and safety, and because the impacts to wildlife are so distressing, but also so as to not exacerbate impacts to wildlife, which is my segue to my colleague Simone from Wildlife Health Australia. And thanks very much. Apologies for talking so fast, but the 9 minutes seems short and there's a lot to convey. Thank you, Jack.
Thanks so much, Fiona. We really appreciate it. And I can see lots and lots of questions that people are putting into that Q&A function. And I can see Dr. Michelle Wille has been answering some of them, and there's other people been answering. We're not going to get to everyone's questions, unfortunately, but we'll be putting some. So please put some into that Q&A. I will hand over now to Wildlife Health Australia's Program Manager for Emergencies, Dr. Simone Vitali. She's going to be talking to us about the advice for the community on what to look for and how to respond. Simone is a vet who's worked in mixed practice before completing a PhD at Murdoch University. She was the senior veterinarian at Perth Zoo for over 15 years and has been involved in wildlife veterinary conservation projects involving a range of species, including Carnaby's cockatoo, the brush-tailed bettong, the Christmas Island blue-tailed skink. Simone joined Wildlife Health Australia in 2022 as the Program Manager for Emergencies, and through that program, WHA, Wildlife Health Australia, works with others to safeguard that health and welfare and biodiversity when it comes to Australian wildlife. Wildlife Health Australia have been the lead body doing some of the work looking at toolboxes and looking at some of those risk assessments. So I will hand over to Dr. Simone Vitali. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jack. So for those of you who aren't aware of Wildlife Health Australia, I just wanted to quickly put us in the picture. We're the coordinating body for wildlife health in Australia, and our principal objectives are the protection and enhancement of the natural environment. We're a non-government organisation, but much of our funding comes from government in support of our contribution to wildlife health knowledge and expertise to biosecurity preparedness. So HPAI is right in our wheelhouse. We work through networks of government and non-government stakeholders to link, inform and support the people concerned with wildlife health. And we contribute our wildlife health knowledge more broadly to disease prevention, preparedness and response. And up there in the corner, you can see just a snapshot of our networks that we rely on to be a real source of truth, I guess, for wildlife health information and resources in Australia. So as you can see, there's a lot of cross-pollination between today's presenters, and Michelle's already covered this information, thank heavens. So I'll just reiterate that the term avian influenza refers to a massive range of viruses that don't behave in the same way and don't all pose the same risks to wildlife. So in this presentation, we're dealing only with the clinical signs of specific response actions in relation to H5N1 2344B. So this has all been covered a little bit. We need to assume that any bird species can be affected by HPAI. The commonly affected wildlife taxa are the ones that you can see there that Michelle's already covered. And the initial presentation could be one sick bird or it could be many. And in answer to a few of the things in the Q&A, absolutely, albatrosses and petrels have been widely affected among the seabirds. And as scavengers, ravens would certainly be a species we'd be keeping our eye on in Australia if and when 2344B makes itself known in our region. Among the mammals, as we've mentioned, predatory and scavenging species are the most likely to be affected. In addition to these, we've seen the outbreaks in marine mammals, particularly in South America, and recent outbreaks in domestic livestock as well. So quite a much wider range of species than we've ever seen before. So in terms of clinical signs, birds and mammals can show a wide range of clinical signs, particularly neurological and respiratory signs, as you can see written there, incoordination, paralysis, seizures, tremors, abnormal postures. We can also see changes to the eyes, conjunctivitis, nasal secretions, head swelling, laboured breathing, and all the way through to sudden death in both birds and mammals. In some cases, we can see very subtle signs such as poor body condition and dullness and quietness. So there's really a huge gamut of signs that we can see. We're likely to see this disease in birds before we see mammals affected, given that most mammals are affected by their contact or association with birds or by eating birds. So a mass mortality of marine mammals, for example, probably won't be our first clue that 2.3.4.4b has made it to our shores. So in the next several slides, I've taken some GIFs from much longer videos of affected birds to show you some of the presentations that may be seen. The original videos are mostly available online, so I've included the links where I can in case you want to see them in their entirety. And just a warning before we go too much further into this, these videos are quite disturbing and distressing to watch. For most individuals, this is not going to be a nice way to die. So here you can see these neurological signs, the incoordination that we talk about, the inability to right themselves, and so on, and also the deaths of closely associated individuals. In this next slide, you can see the lack of head control and head posture, the dullness, animals that are just not doing what you would expect them to do. And in this one, again, this lack of head control, the arched head that we see in a lot of seabirds and the tremors. Respiratory signs might be a real feature in some species. So this open mouth breathing, the panting, the inability to stay upright. And just to show that this is not just a seabird thing, here's a raptor showing a little bit of that incoordination, staggering, and often as you stimulate these birds, you can exacerbate these clinical signs that otherwise might be quite subtle. So it might be HPAI. What do I do? Okay, there's three parts that we want you to be doing. Firstly, we want you to keep yourself and others safe. HPAI can infect people, and infections with the current strain are uncommon, but they have occurred in people directly interacting with infected birds. If you have a look at the Department of Health and Aged Care websites, you can get more information on how to keep yourself safe. We want you to record what you see, time, date, location. Take photos or footage if possible. And as tempting as it is to get up close and personal, just remember, firstly, to keep yourself safe. But secondly, a view of the whole scene is really useful for putting a close-up image in context. So don't forget to broaden out and take the whole scene as if you possibly can. Next point, report. As mentioned a couple of times already, there is a 24-hour emergency animal disease hotline, 1-800-675-888. If you suspect avian influenza, we want you to be telling the emergency animal disease hotline. And those 3 points, avoid, record, report, there's a great video put out by the Northern Australia Quarantine Strategy, and there's the link to it here on the slide if you want those reiterated. There's often a feeling of, oh gosh, I don't want to make a scene here. It might be HPAI, but that's a whole lot of signs that I've seen. And if you're in wildlife care, you know that dead birds drop out of the sky every single day. What if it isn't? When should I call? Okay, so we try to give you a few extra criteria here, particularly if you're working in the wildlife industry and you tend to see a lot of animals. So the more likely things to be associated with HPAI are clusters of 5 or more of any bird species. If you see susceptible bird species, there's an interest in any number of those, and any species with signs of avian influenza, as you've seen in those slides. So the respiratory signs, the neurological signs. I guess the main take-home message here is, if in doubt, please report. Reporting will alert authorities to the event, and that enables them to evaluate the need for diagnostic testing or other investigation. And even if testing isn't undertaken on the basis of your report, each individual report is going to help inform our understanding of the disease and how to manage it. And if a decision is made not to act on the first report, it's important to have that first report so that when you get the 5th report, you go, okay, this is important. This is one that we really need to be focusing our constrained resources on. So remember that EAD hotline number. But also remember that we are here. We're in preparedness. So we've got a big opportunity now to emphasise that there are still many uncertainties about how 2344B an outbreak might start and progress, and what our response might look like. So the more we can do now to understand the disease and organise ourselves locally, the softer the landing will be for our precious wildlife species. So let's talk about what you can do now. First step, get informed. So we've already given you some great key websites to have a look at and to bookmark, and we hope that you will have a look at those and really look at the information that's there, because the distillation of the most important information that we think you need to know in terms of wildlife. Michelle Wille's website, also very important. You can undertake training. There are foundational courses in emergency animal disease awareness that are free, that are available on the DAF website. It takes about 2 hours, and it will give you a huge insight into the sorts of legislative and biosecurity frameworks that people like Fiona are grappling with every day to make the best case and get the best outcomes for wildlife. If you work with wildlife and you're a wildlife manager or a wildlife rehabilitator, plan and prepare. Become familiar with what the current national biosecurity plans are for avian influenza. They're available on the DAF website on the under AusVet plan. As has been mentioned a couple of times, Wildlife Health Australia has created 2 risk mitigation toolboxes, one for wildlife managers and one for wildlife care providers, to help you with that background understanding and knowing what to do and how to assess your risk and to plan to mitigate that risk. And we would refer you all to have a look at those. And finally, do keep an eye out. Know the clinical signs, as we've talked about, and report those unusual mortality or illnesses to the EAD hotline. Put the number on speed dial on your phone now so that you've got it handy. And finally, I'd just like to acknowledge, as the other presenters have done, the many agencies, managers, ecologists, researchers, rehabilitators, a huge number of wildlife stakeholders who are working to promote HPAI, H5 preparedness for wildlife populations in Australia. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much for that, Simone. Really appreciate it. Now, we've had a lot of questions, so I'm going to go straight into those questions and just start with some questions direct to some of the panelists. So, Michelle, just a brief response from you. Maybe just going in a bit, what are we expecting in terms of some of the Australia-specific impacts that this could have if it turns up? What can we expect to be seeing in terms of Australian wildlife as opposed to what's been overseas, and maybe also just a little bit of what are those expected first places it may turn up in Australia?
I think that this virus is going to do the same here that it's done everywhere else. It's going to rock up and it's going to cause massive, widespread deaths with very, very large outbreaks and lots of dead animals on the landscape. So it could arrive and get into a population or a location where there's lots of water birds, and potentially kill 60% of the birds there. There's no way to know. There's always quite a lot of heterogeneity in this, but if we look at what's happened elsewhere in the world, I think catastrophic is the only thing to say. It has been very, very awful. We don't know exactly where this virus will land first. It will very much depend on the route of entry, with which birds it has arrived. So whether it comes with shorebirds or seabirds, or if you look in the risk assessment, we've also thought about things like ducks through a different route. We may see different patterns. So for example, a shorebird, well, the first point of landing may be in the southern parts of Australia. It might start there. It may be in the northern parts of Australia. We can really only speculate, but the most likely first landing place is probably the northern parts of Australia if it comes in with shorebirds. But I just think that everyone should be vigilant and ready, and we shouldn't take a back seat here just because we're in Victoria and we're far from the north. Yeah.
Thank you. And Simone and Brant, I might just ask you guys to put on your cameras if you can. Oh, Fiona, are you able just to talk us through how some of the prioritisation is occurring? You mentioned some of those priorities, but how that prioritisation is occurring from the federal government at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm assuming you're meaning some of the work around susceptible species. And so Michelle and some of her colleagues and others have been doing some really important foundational work in that space. I guess what we're keen to do is to bring that together at the national level and enhance it in some ways. So looking at species that are susceptible to the disease, but are also vulnerable from other perspectives. So they might have very small populations or already be endangered. So on our threatened species list, they're already threatened with extinction. So we're looking at the species which tend to aggregate in large numbers. They might be migratory, they might be water birds or mixed with water birds, or they might be scavengers, so mammals or birds which or predators of these species. We're looking to draw on what's happened overseas to help us understand the sorts of species that will be impacted, but also noting that many of Australia's species are endemic, so the experience here might be unique. So we want to map these species, understand the locations where the virus is most likely to enter the country and spread, and together all of this information should help us to make better species and site-specific management advice and prepared response plans.
Thank you. Simone, I guess one of the things that we know, you've talked about the potential for some site level planning. What are some of the options, I guess, that are available to land managers and governments for actually reducing the impact if it does turn up?
I think the first thing to say here is that it's important that we approach this on a very specific population level. So oils ain't oils. You can't take what's done in one area and say that's what's going to be effective in another area. So what we're encouraging wildlife managers to do is look at their population, understand the likely risks of avian influenza coming in, where that comes from, what the pathways are, and how it would, again, go out as well. So things like looking at your basic biosecurity and what do we do normally to stop diseases coming into our wild population? Do we need to tighten that up? Who are the people moving in and out of this population? Are there ways that we can mitigate the risk of them bringing it in, depending on where we think they would bring it in from? We know that once it gets in, it's going to spread very rapidly between animals that species of susceptible kinds that colonise. Which are our species in our populations that do that? Where are we likely to see those risks? We know that in susceptible species, we're going to see a lot of animals dying. What are the risks to our population if we leave those animals there? Is it in the interests of that population to clean up carcasses? In some instances, that has been a helpful thing. but it's not going to be the right answer in all situations. So we need to weigh up feasibility, human safety against what it would mean for that wild population if we can clean up, so to speak. So there's a whole lot of things that we need to think about specific to the population we're dealing with, and the risk mitigation toolboxes work you through that processes.
Excellent, thank you. And so Brant Smith, who's on here from DAF, the Department of Agriculture federally as well. Brant, I wonder if you could just briefly talk us through, I know there's been some consideration of vaccine potential in wildlife populations, the thinking and the work that's going on in that space at the moment.
Jack, it looks like Brant might have frozen, so I'll start to address that question if you don't mind.
Sure, I'm good, thank you.
So certainly there is consideration of vaccine for native species in Australia at the moment, and that is a pathway that we are working through. So to help inform that, we've had a few meetings with our US veterinary and conservation agency counterparts, and also in New Zealand. And many of the listeners will be aware vaccines have been used on the Californian condor, which is a critically endangered species, and are being trialled for some New Zealand species. We see it as an option, but definitely not a silver bullet. There's a huge amount of complexity in applying vaccines, both to captive threatened species, but definitely to threatened species in the wild, given the need to be able to, for wild species, recapture them. So you've got to administer that vaccine at least twice at the moment. I know there's some experimental vaccines which might be able to get around that, but also possibly 3 times to take blood samples and things to see how effective it has been. We would need to be able to recapture those birds in the wild to repeat that over time. And I guess, so that I'll just leave it at that at the moment, and Brant can add to that if he was able to capture everything that was being said.
Just further to what Fiona has stated, so in my role, we work through the processes around the permits, the emergency approvals, and the use for those vaccines, but it is absolutely something that we are working through. We can prioritise some of that. So I know a lot of vaccine entry takes a lot of time in other situations, but there are means where we can look at emergency use approvals through the APVMA and others. So it's certainly something that we will continue to pursue. As Fiona's also said, it's not the be all or end all for everything. It has to be targeted, and particularly, it might be useful in kind of captive species and areas that you can recapture birds to do it. But there are some strains now, as Fiona said, that are far more effective. Previously, the H5 strains haven't been terribly protective, but now this seems to be more correlated with the circulating strains, which is good. And then just super quickly elsewhere, what we're doing. So my role, for people who don't know me, is I'm the National Animal Disease Preparedness Coordinator. I'm a veterinarian and I lead the animal division. So we are using this as a great opportunity with our sort of national approach across all of affected agencies, environment, health, ourselves, the National Emergency Management Agency, Prime Minister and Cabinet. Everyone is dialed into this. We are taking this as my #1 priority. And then working through the states and territories, and right down to all you folks who are incredibly important in how this all comes together. So thanks for inviting me, and for Jack and others for instigating this discussion. It's been really useful, and I'm very happy to take any other questions. Thanks.
Thank you. And I might segue into one I've got here from Georgina Wood, saying there are lots of offers being made here by folks on this webinar to be part of a grassroots response across the country. Is there a coordination hub somewhere that can take up these offers? I'm not sure if that's Fiona or Simone or Brant.
I think something that we need to make clear to people is that, and it's horrible to talk about, but I think it needs to be talked about, the prognosis for affected birds is going to be very, very poor. We cannot start talking about rescue as if we're going to be treating these birds or saving these birds. Overwhelmingly, the role of rehabilitation overseas when this disease has impacted wildlife has been to effect early humane euthanasia. So I think it's really important that people don't think that if we get in there and have a really great group effort that we're going to rehabilitate wildlife for return to the wild. There have been very, very small number of cases worldwide where rehabilitation centres with good resources and who have spent a lot of time euthanasing a lot of birds have attempted treatment of very mild cases where they have learned from the euthanasia of a lot of cases what might be possible. We are not there by any means in Australia yet. We are going to have to resign ourselves to euthanasing an absolute bunch of birds before we get to the point where we can do something based on what we learn. Over to you, Michelle.
I would just like to add to one thing to your point. I think you're absolutely correct, Simone. The only caveat and the only exception has been in cases where people are dealing with endangered species. So there are almost no individuals left of African penguins. Those animals, they are desperately trying their best to save through rehabilitation because that population is likely to be extinct in the next 10 or 20 years, right? In general, Simone is absolutely right, but in sort of these sort of lower species populations, we start thinking about different things, right? We think about rehabilitation, vaccination programs, again, targeted and directed to these highly endangered or highly threatened species, if that makes sense. But broadly to wild birds in general does not make sense, not logistically feasible. So yeah, that's the only caveat.
Can I just ask on that though, the carcass management side of things, because that seems to be something which has had promise overseas for reducing mortality rates. Is that something that you're putting separate to that element of rehabilitation?
Yeah, I wouldn't consider that rehabilitation. When I'm talking about rehab, I'm talking about bringing birds from the wild into captivity in order to either treat or manage or prevent their exposure. I think, again, as Michelle says, with highly threatened species, things come on the table that otherwise aren't. But I think we need to recognise the massive, massive resourcing and money and people power, expert people power. We're not just talking about we just need us all to come together and do things here. We need a huge amount of resources to enable that to happen. So we need to, I think Fiona's point about the importance of thinking about other ways that we can bolster the resilience of these populations is really valid, because we're going to have much more success in all the things that we're already doing to preserve habitat, to prevent other preventable diseases. Those are going to be equally, if not more important than what we can do in terms of highly pathogenic avian influenza.
Thank you. And just before I go to you, Fiona, there's just a few other questions that you might want to answer together. So one's about, there seems to be quite a few about what communication there is with local governments in particular and veterinarians, and also questions about that sort of national communications rollout. So maybe, how can people get involved, but also what is the government doing in terms of some of that rollout of comms and engagement?
Yeah, sure. I'll just go back to carcass removal just quickly first. And as you're aware, there is some evidence in some cases that carcass removal can reduce the mortality rate. I just want to make clear on the line that we are not advocating that as a management response. Generally, we don't want people to go near dead animals at all. Carcass removal may be considered in very bespoke circumstances at particular sites or for particular species. So that is, I just want to make that very, very clear. There's lots of risk with actually exacerbating the spread of the disease with people going in to do that. So as far as communications go, yes, the Australian government is developing further communications. There's already some very good resources on the Wildlife Health Australia website, which I think the link has been provided here. We're actually working through now some more detailed communications strategies and pieces to reach out to different audiences. So developing personas to understand how to best reach those target audiences and what might be most useful for them, noting that the needs for different different stakeholders are going to be very different in this space. So there's some communications material available already. We're talking to our state and territory counterparts about this, and have identified this as a really important component of an effective response, and there's more work to come in this space.
Excellent. Did you want to add anything to that?
Grant's got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a really good outline. I mean, for us, the communications approach is going to be critical, so that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, right through from the Commonwealth through to the states and territories and on the ground right across the board. Because when and if something like this occurs, the more joined up, the quickly we can respond to it, the consistency and approach to messaging will be really important. We already saw with the H7 outbreak, and just in my home state of ACT, some of the confusions around backyard poultry owners and pet bird owners, and what do we do and how do we manage these things. So there's a lot more work to do, certainly on that front, but it is an absolute number one priority as part of one of our sort of lines of action. And we've been working quite closely with some folks in the departments and senior crisis management communicators to make sure that we can build on all the good efforts that are out there, but make it a far more dialed in and across the board. So that's a huge focus for us.
And, I've got a question here from Stan Bolton about the financial resources that the Commonwealth are putting into this specifically for the wildlife response. Are you able to talk us through, beyond just the departmental resources, what sort of funding has been made available, both available for groups, but also that you're putting into the response at the moment?
Just reiterating what Fiona has said, some of the funding is already publicly announced, but ultimately we need to do more in this space. And the reality is that this is an unprecedented situation for us. So we are certainly working really closely with our agencies to see what else can be done. So I would say sort of watch this space. And it's really important that it doesn't just sit at the high level, that it sort of empowers different groups to do the things they need to. The challenge for us always is, though, there's 1,000 things we can do. So the key will be, how do we prioritise? What are the most important things to do? And I know that IFC's provided a list of really sensible options and others to look at. So particularly as part of the exercising that we're doing at the moment, key to that will be testing the system. Where are our gaps? Where are our strengths? What can we build on? And then what are the kind of key action points thereafter? So this is all working ahead at pace. This is working ahead at a pace none of us are comfortable with, but that's where we're at. And I think that's really important. But there has to be more sort of support to make sure these things work. So that's certainly something where we'll be progressing in coming weeks, but we'll make sure there's engagement on that as we go too.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. I might wrap up here because we've hit the hour. I really appreciate Dr. Michelle Wille, Dr. Fiona Fraser, Dr. Simone Vitali, and Brant Smith. Are you a doctor as well, Brant? It's not, yeah, you are, Dr. Brant Smith. All our doctors. I feel like Dr. Carl when he does his things. Thank you so much for being part of it. And I can see we had about 1,500 people on at the peak. I know there was well over 2,000 registered. The Biodiversity Council, who've been the host for this, they are going to be sending out an email to everyone who's registered. There'll be some key links there to information for people, some of the key things that have come from this webinar, places that you can go to. Each of the panelists have got some links to provide. We'll also be putting out publicly a link to this webinar so that you can share it within your departments, within your organisations, friends and family. That'd be great. There's a lot of questions on there. So just to let you all know, what we're going to do is we'll put together, some of them for the department to see in general, to help them with a lot of their communications. I just right at the end, just wanted to give a specific shout out to Justine Saunders, who's headed up biosecurity federally. We've seen a really fantastic recent response across the agencies and across the government, and I think that's been driven at the highest levels, and I want to acknowledge that, because it's not always the case that we get fantastically responsive agencies on this, and both through environment and agriculture at a federal level, that has been the case recently, and that is really appreciated. So thank you, Fiona, thank you, Brant, and thank you, Justine, who I think has also been on this call. the organisations that have hosted this, Australian Land Conservation Alliance, the Biodiversity Council, WIRES, BirdLife Australia, Australian Marine Conservation Society, and the Invasive Species Council. We're going to keep working pretty hard on this. We're pushing governments, we're working with governments, and we will be expecting that governments put more resources in, and we look forward to that. We encourage everyone out there to support our organisations, because all of us are built on donations and built on community support. So real big thank you to everyone, and we will get this webinar out there into the world as soon as possible. Thank you.